Good morning. It is great to be here. So as Ben said, I'm Emma. I'm from Beacon Church in Brixton, South London, where I lead the pastoral care team. And I also co-lead a charity called Orchards. And Orchards works with women who've experienced sexual exploitation. So that might be through prostitution, or that might be through trafficking for sexual purposes. And we provide safe housing that's linked to a local church, counselling with a Christian counsellor who specialises in sexual trauma, and wraparound support, coming alongside women and walking alongside them as they overcome the multiple barriers to exit. But what we're looking at in this session is to begin to explore the idea that we need to reframe, rethink some of the ways in which we engage with young people on issues of relationships, partly in the wake of #MeToo. Now, as I say that, I am really, really conscious that there are some awesome youth groups represented here, actually. And you're already doing some amazing work with young people grappling with these issues. I have massive respect for the youth leaders at our church. Others of you are doing incredible work in a professional capacity. Maybe you're not able to have faith-based conversations, but you are able to pray into them in your context. There's real power in that. There may be others of you that are looking at these issues from afar, maybe as a parent, and you're a bit overwhelmed. I get that. Or maybe you feel that actually doesn't really affect you. These are things that youth workers talk about over here, and you feel quite disconnected from them. But the truth is, if you know a young person who owns a phone, we need to engage. We have to engage. But before I explore that question in more detail, and as Ben said, we won't be able to do a 10-year strategy in a short session. We're going to begin to explore it. But before beginning to explore it, I wanted to start by telling a few stories. Many of you may have had, words or pictures that maybe God's given a friend of yours when they've been praying, and it's really encouraged you. It's really spoke to you in your walk with God. I wanted to start by sharing one that my wonderful friend Jem had with me when we were praying together, and it should come up on the screen. So this is, but random as it looks, this is an example of the Japanese art of kintsugi. Some of you may be familiar with that, some not. The idea is that broken pottery is fixed with gold. It's this idea that something beautiful is made out of the brokenness. And it reminds me of those passages in Isaiah 61 that I know a lot of us will be really familiar with, where it talks about how he binds up the brokenhearted, how he sets captives free. And then those he restores, they go out and rebuild ancient ruins, and they go out and they restore the places long devastated. Don't you love that about God? He is so awesome at restoring. And those he restores, he uses to be restorers. I love that about him. And of course, there are many, many areas in my life that God is still working on. I wanted to share some of the stories behind this picture that my lovely friend had for me, that God gave her. And we would call them now, perhaps, #MeToo stories, although I wouldn't have used that phrase at the time. And as I share them, I want us to keep that picture in mind. And as we explore these issues, I want us to keep that picture in mind, because sometimes these things can feel quite dark, they can feel quite heavy. But I want us to explore them from a point of fixing our eyes on the one who has the power to restore, and he hasn't changed. Okay? And as we look at these things, I'm also very, very conscious that my stories are not representative of all the stories and all the voices on these issues. And I'm also very conscious there are far more extreme stories than my own. Certainly some of the just incredible, courageous women that I've had the privilege of coming alongside pastorally. And potentially some in this room or watching this online. But those aren't my stories to tell. So I'll start by telling some of mine to begin to explore these issues. Okay. So 17 years ago now, I was 20. I asked Jesus into my life. I was an atheist before that. And I was filled with the most amazing love I'd ever experienced. But both before that and after that, I had what we might now call #MeToo experiences. I remember the first time, I was probably 13, but I would have looked a lot younger than that, and I was dressed like a child. And a grown man came up to me when I was shopping with a friend of mine during the day, and he said to me, "I bet you haven't been broken in yet. I'll break you in." And I remember feeling quite scared, quite disgusted, and I knew what he meant. Like many young girls, it's very common from my teens to early 20s, I was constantly being beeped at, having guys shout things about different parts of my body, or being very, very explicit about what they wanted to do. I was followed home. I literally have no idea how many times I've been groped by random people on public transport or in swimming pools or just out and about. On several occasions, I've had men masturbate in front of me on public transport. Someone once did that whilst following me home. Someone else did that outside my house when I was a student. And then really scarily, when I was working overseas, a colleague of mine started doing that in a car when they were driving me somewhere, and that was terrifying. And when I was, say, 17, my boyfriend at the time cheated on me, and his best friend told me. And while I was upset, he forced himself on me. And I didn't consent, but I didn't fight, because it was easier at that time to zone out and just go numb. And I stayed numb. And a few years after walking with God, I was maybe about 24, all of a sudden that part of me that was numb started feeling. And I felt really, really angry. I remember being in a coffee shop with a friend of mine. I don't know what she was saying, but all I could see was a guy on top of me, and I wanted to scream, "Get off!" And I remember being on the tube around that time and seeing guys look at porn, and I wanted to punch them. I was really angry. And I remember saying, "God, why is this coming up now?" And I think sometimes the Holy Spirit knows when you're ready to deal with something. Because I heard him say, "I'm bringing it up because I want to heal you." And so I met for a period of time with a couple of women at my church, a different church. And they prayed with me. And I chose to forgive the guys that hurt me, not because it meant it was okay, because it wasn't okay, and we have to be very, very clear about that. But because we know God asks us to forgive, doesn't he? But also, that was a gateway to him being able to heal my heart. He healed my feelings of shame, that feeling that, there's something fundamentally wrong with me. I heard him say that no, to him, I was worth what he went through to get me back. And I encountered his father heart for me. And he did such a deep work of healing in my heart that now I'm working with women, alongside women who've experienced very severe, far more severe gender-based violence. But it doesn't touch on my pain, doesn't touch on my stuff. And I'm going to come back to that story a bit later. But don't you just love that about God? He's so good at restoring. And those he restores, he uses to be restorers, and he hasn't changed. So back to the question, why is it that we need to reframe some of our approaches, some of the ways that we engage with young people? If he hasn't changed, if his truth hasn't changed, why do some of our approaches need to change if we want to see transformation? I don't know about you, but maybe some of you have been in the old school youth church, youth work, sex talk. I don't know if you know the ones. The guys are taken off over here and they hear a talk about lust and porn, and the girls are taken off over here. Maybe there's something around body image, and they're told to dress modestly. Or maybe you've been in mainly secular contexts. So I'm oversimplifying. I know there are much better approaches than that. Or maybe you've been in mainly secular contexts and heard a lot of personal safety talks or safe sex information. And of course, there's value in these things. But why do some of these approaches need to change if we're to really reach young people and see change in this area? Well, first of all, we need to reframe some of our approaches in recognition of the fact that the context is far more nuanced. Boys are increasingly struggling with eating disorders, self-harming because of online body shaming. Boys may have experienced sexual assault. In the old approach, there's no way he's going to be able to come forward with that. And he'll be pushed further into shame, pushed further into the struggle. I shouldn't be feeling like this because I'm a boy. Girls may be struggling with lust. And increasingly, we are seeing an increasing number of girls watching pornography. There's no way in that traditional approach that she's going to be able to come forward and say, I'm struggling with this. I shouldn't be feeling like that because I'm a girl. She'll be pushed further into shame and pushed further into the struggle. Sexual assault can happen in a male or female same-sex context. There have been 2 very high-profile examples of that in the media recently, haven't there? But I'm also aware of them from different contexts. We need to name some of these nuanced issues within our context to lift the lid on the conversation. So there's less room for shame to fester. And then facilitate encounters for young people with their Heavenly Father who knows it all anyway and loves them completely as a starting point for healing to happen. Secondly, we need to reframe some of our approaches, some of the ways that we engage with young people in the wake of #MeToo. So I started, didn't I, by giving a few examples of my own #MeToo type experiences. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the campaign, but just to recap, it started, didn't it, when allegations of sexual assault, sexual harassment started coming out against a well-known producer. And then more and more celebrities started coming forward saying, yeah, it's happened to me. And then this tweet, it should come up, was posted. If you have experienced sexual assault, sexual harassment, reply me too. So that was posted around midday on October the 15th, 2017. It had been used more than 200,000 times by the end of the day and tweeted more than 500,000 times by the end of the next day. On Facebook, the hashtag was used by more than 4.7 million people in 12 million posts during the first 24 hours alone. And then it spread worldwide with similar movements popping up in Spain, Latin America, other parts of the world, with predominantly women and girls saying, yeah, me too. That's my experience. It happened to me. And at this point, I want to reiterate again that sexual assault is not an exclusively female experience. And for guys, for men and boys that have experienced this, there can be particular challenges in processing what has happened and accessing help. So we need to name that and create spaces where healing and support can happen. But we also need to acknowledge that this disproportionately affects women and girls still. According to the World Bank, women and girls aged 15 to 44 worldwide are more at risk of rape and domestic violence than they are from cancer, car accidents, war, and malaria combined. Why is that relevant to a youth culture conference in the UK? It's a fair question. It's relevant because we are seeing the same dynamics play out within youth culture. So trends like upskirting, taking a photo up someone's skirt without their permission, posting it online. Revenge porn, posting or threatening to post intimate images or videos of someone online have become prevalent enough for them to be included in the Mayor of London's current strategy for tackling violence against women and girls in the capital. We're also seeing trends of normalised violence against women and girls play out within sexual relationships. I don't know if you saw this, but before Christmas, the BBC published a study, and their research had found that over a third of young UK women had experienced unwanted strangling, spitting, or hitting during sexual relationships. And they were attributing that to those things being played out in porn. Now, I get it, that is really hard to hear, and it makes us feel uncomfortable. I do understand that. But it might just be that we need to come alongside someone who's experienced or is experiencing some of these things. And we need to understand that sexual harassment, sexual assault, however it presents, and I've given lots of different examples of what it looks like, a very common response is, I deserved it. It's my fault. There's something wrong with me. And that sense of shame can be a real barrier to healing. And that's exacerbated by some of the traditional messaging, which can unintentionally communicate the message that the onus is solely on you, it's solely on women and girls to make sure it doesn't happen to them. Or it's solely on those who've experienced it to make sure it doesn't happen to them. We need to over-communicate the opposite. The sexual harassment is never okay. Now that might seem like a really silly thing to say, because I think if I were to do a very quick straw poll, raise your hand if you are in favour of the promotion of sexual harassment. I don't think many of you would put your hands up, or at least not in this session. I won't, but if I were to. But we need to understand, we need to over-communicate it to counteract the culture. So if when we're giving personal safety information, and I'm not knocking personal safety information, of course that's important. It's not foolproof, but it's important. When we're doing that, we need dual messaging. At the same time, we need the dual message of, but to be very clear, it's never okay. We need to create spaces where young people are encouraged to dialogue on this, because you need men, women together to really see change in this area, boys, girls together to really see change in this area. We need to create spaces where they're encouraged to use their voices to challenge, normalise harassment and normalise sexual violence. So we challenge this in part through our words. But we also challenge it through the culture that we create in our context. That sort of sense of family that Ben was talking about a moment ago. I love that verse in 1 Timothy 2, I'm sure a lot of you are really familiar with, where it says, treat older men like fathers, younger men like brothers, older women like mothers, younger women like sisters in all purity. And of course, I'm sure we're really aware that a very obvious form of dysfunction is inappropriate relationships developing. I'm sure we're aware of that. There's a less obvious form of dysfunction, though, which reinforces the issue. Sometimes, within our context, there's no real relationship, no real communication between fathers and daughters in our churches, or between brothers and sisters. And And where that is the case, we inadvertently reinforce the lie that the only way in which men can relate to women is sexually or not at all. We inadvertently reinforce the lie to women and girls in particular that your value, your worth is in your sexuality. It's the same lie that's being reinforced outside. If we are to challenge the highly sexualized culture, we need to present a new culture where appropriate relationships, but real relationships, are modeled so that it looks like something. Because actually, that then creates an environment in which people can heal from Me Too type experiences. And it also creates an environment that can help to prevent some, not all, but some Me Too type experiences. Because when appropriate relationships are the norm, you can spot inappropriate relationships a mile off. Maybe that looks like a father in the church being a father to a daughter who's lost their dad. Obviously, we need to be smart about how we do this, but we do need to find a way. Thirdly, we need to reframe some of the ways that we engage with young people on these issues so that we are speaking into them and praying into them at identity level. Because there are a number of identity level lies that underpin the culture in which #MeToo type experiences occur. I'll give you a few examples. For those of us that work in the violence against women and girls sector, or maybe in youth work or social work, and we're dealing with these issues day in, day out, or for those of us who have our own #MeToo type experiences, there can be a real temptation to go to the place of it is because all men are. But the problem with that is that when we do that, we push men and boys further into shame, and we then reinforce the very thing we're trying to fight against. We need to reframe that approach too. So tracking back to my story at the beginning, at that point in my life when I was 24 and I was praying regularly through the things that had happened, I remember really clearly a day when I heard God say to me, "That's my sons that you are hating." And, in some ways I hadn't always had the best experiences of guys, but I had begun to develop quite a lot of all men are, all guys are, negative thought patterns, and they weren't in line with how God saw his sons that are made in his image. So I had to repent of that. And I began this process of daily, hourly, meditating on the truth that no, men are God's sons and they're made in his image. And I choose to trust you, God, to bring men into my life who treat me with dignity and respect. And that was hard. It was really hard because when I would be praying that and then I would walk along the road and the same things were happening. But gradually, over time, that truth sort of solidified in my heart. And gradually, over time, do you know what? God did bring men into my life who treat me with dignity and respect. In church, colleagues. After a few years, he brought my husband into my life who does treat me with dignity and respect, and he's wonderful. And now, in my church, I'm surrounded by guys who treat me like a daughter, like a sister. That is my norm. And so even though I'm exposed to some horrible examples of gender-based violence at work sometimes, I couldn't go to that all men are place, even if I tried, because I know it's not truth, and also it's not my experience now. Now, that same lie can be reinforced from a different angle by both men and women. Sometimes, maybe socially, maybe pastorally, we can hear sexual harassment or maybe even sexual assault, but certainly sexual harassment or pornography consumption justified with Come on, it's just what guys are like. Now, please, please, please don't mishear me. I'm not minimizing the struggle with lust. That is very real. It's a real challenge. I'm not minimizing the struggle with pornography. Porn is available from a very, very young age. It's really accessible, it's free, it's highly addictive, it's challenging to walk out of. That's not the point I'm making. I'm also not making the point that attraction is bad or we should feel guilty for that. Attraction is healthy. I'm not making a point about physiological drive. What I am saying, though, is that it's problematic when we use that as our rationale for sexual harassment and porn consumption. When we suggest that sexually harassing someone or watching porn is an inevitable extension of somebody's identity as a man, because it's not, it's a distortion of it. And that's a really, really important distinction. And when we do that, when we justify it with that lie, then we're selling guys short, because men and boys are worth so much more than that. We wouldn't, for example, say to a girl who was struggling with an eating disorder, come on, it's just what girls are like. We wouldn't, would we? We want to bring healing at identity level. Yes, this is a really common struggle and it's a really difficult struggle, but it is not who you are. It's not because of who you are, it's in spite of it. Do you see the distinction? Yeah. We need to ask the God who made us and what he says about who we are. And then we're fighting the battle from a different place. Because when we mess up, it's not, well, of course, it's who I am. No, it's in spite of it. And there's grace, and then you can step back into who you really are. And then there's more potential for change. Okay? Other identity level lies that underpin the culture in which #MeToo type experiences occur. Girls in particular, but also boys increasingly, told from a very, very, very young age, your value is in your sexiness. And this, by the way, is what it looks like. That is where love is. That is where acceptance is. And that message can go deep. And it breaks an identity. But then, when that identity goes deep and she in any ways acts in a way that we would deem to be in line with that identity, that's been hammered home from so many different angles, then we start to shame, don't we? And we start to label. And we know what those labels are. There are so many of them. We need to challenge that too. Anywhere we see that happening, maybe in our own judgments, we need to challenge that and bring healing identity level and pray into that. It's one other, maybe less obvious example of an identity level lie that underpins this culture. If we hear people verbalizing, or men are type rhetoric, or anger, we can be very quick to move back. Both men and women, we can do this, and maybe dismiss her as an angry feminist. Maybe we're a bit scared. We need to understand, actually, that a very, very normal response to sexual assault and sexual harassment is anger. And that might range from mild irritation to real anger, depending on the experience. And no, we don't want people to stay in that place. But we do need to allow them to process it. So instead of moving backwards, we might need to move forwards and ask, why do you feel like that? And then really, really listen until we hear. And if there's a story behind it, I'm so sorry that happened. That was not okay. Thank you for telling me. That was really brave. Because that might just be the beginning of someone's journey towards healing. So we need to reframe our approaches, probably for a number of reasons, but I've given a few. We need to recognize the context is more nuanced. Name some of those nuanced issues to lift up that sense of shame. we need to challenge in lots of different ways any way in which sexual harassment is deemed to be okay, through our words, through encouraging young people to do the same, through the culture that we create. And we need to pray into and speak into these things at identity level. Now, I'm really conscious that some of these things I've talked about can feel quite dark. Maybe they feel quite heavy. Some of you, maybe you're practitioners, you're working on the front line in these kinds of issues, and you're really burnt out. And I get that. Or maybe you're hearing them for the first time, some of these things, and it feels a bit uncomfortable. Or you feel a bit fearful as a parent. Or maybe you have your own #MeToo type story as a man or a woman, and it feels really raw. And if that is you, then I would encourage you to find someone that you trust to talk to and pray with as the beginning of healing to happen. And it may be also that if we're really honest, we're realizing that we've been the cause of someone's #MeToo. And if that is you, then I would encourage you to find someone you can talk to and pray with too. And know that there's grace. And know that doesn't have to continue being your story. You might need to make some things right, but it doesn't have to continue being your story. But wherever we're at, I would just encourage us to engage, however difficult it feels. And then from that point of engaging, to fix our eyes again on the one who had victory over all of these things at the cross. It says, doesn't it, in John 1 verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And that is really key, because sometimes we can feel overwhelmed by the darkness when we look at these issues. But the darkness has not overcome God's light. He's as good at restoring as he's ever been. And that is my prayer over you guys as we move into the discussion times, that from this place of engaging, you'd fix your eyes back on the one who is so good at restoring. And that you would see his kingdom come in identities, in relationships, in the internet, in schools and colleges and universities and workplaces and your churches. You would see young people healed and restored, and that you would see them going out to rebuild ancient ruins. You'd see them going out to restore the places long devastated. In Jesus' name. Thank you. Amen. I think I've got